All right, so this is the last week, and I'm not going to do my usual kind of drag you through a whole bunch of ideas. We'll do a quick set of Google searches here to get situated in the subject. But as I mentioned in class, this is not my area of expertise. I've worked in this field on and off for the past 4 or 5 years, but only academically. So in terms of planning, it's kind of the most hypothetical one that we're doing. That said, from a data science perspective, law and social justice, um, law has in law enforcement has a long history of data collection. Social justice is something that we can study, but we're going to be using different data sets that are kind of not particular to that field of study, and we're trying to interpolate between them to kind of come up with an idea of kind of how to visualize it. Hopefully there are some states. I know that California recently passed a few laws about taking data on police activity specifically to measure whether or not the officer's actions are just or unjust in different ways. But in general, law enforcement have kind of kept track of their data in kind of a different way. So from a data science perspective, we can kind of look at law enforcement in several angles. There's crime incidents, which are the activity of law enforcement. So when they respond to requests or to calls for law enforcement. There are arrests, which are kind of one type of summary punishment that happens. So if an officer arrives on a scene, they can do they can issue citations or warnings. An arrest is kind of a summary judgment, meaning sometimes they arrest with a warrant, but sometimes they arrest what's called on view, which means that they claim to witness the crime and therefore don't need a warrant to take a person into custody. The third kind is there's a jail population that is usually measured, and the jail is different from the prison in that the jail is usually the place that someone would await trial, or they might be there for shorter term stints. And then there's the prison population, and the prison population is the main kind of body of incarcerated people. And then I think a fifth kind of data that we'll look at is police jurisdiction boundaries, right? And so for different levels of government, whether it's city, municipal, county, state, and federal, there are different types of law enforcement officers. We're not going to look at that too specifically. We're going to be just looking at the Boston Police Department. Especially in rural places, there tends to be more of a hierarchy, right? There might be a town police, but then there's a county sheriff, and then there's a statewide troopers, and then of course at the federal level we have kind of federal agents, which are the FBI and different organizations like that. For just the Boston Police Department, they're primarily responsible for all law enforcement in Boston, although there are other agencies that do different types of law enforcement there. But we'll be looking at the Boston Police Department in particular, and 5 years worth of their activity data. So anyway, we've got crime incidents, arrests, jail population, prison population, but we're also going to look at those police jurisdiction boundaries, because those jurisdiction boundaries are even broken up into sub-districts. It's not just the city of Boston, right? There's different districts. So what are we looking at here? This is kind of just a site that shows some macro trends, of course, macrotrends.net. And it does show an overall decline in crime over the past kind of 10, 20 years in Boston. But this is a metric. This is a measured variable based on, based on police activity and kind of what the police are reporting. Not that we want to assume it's wrong or it's not right, because clearly this is, we would think, a good trend. But I don't think we need to belabor the point that I think discontent with law enforcement has kind of been doing a reverse thing over these past 20 years. That ultimately people are becoming more and more enraged by different types of activities, specifically with minority communities and the killings of unarmed black men, among other types of racially profiled actions and murders and crimes and things like that. And so there are other types of media kind of records where people are starting to say, okay, well, shouldn't there be a database that shows, you know, the disciplinary actions on the police, or why isn't there data that shows us when police are either not following the rules, or they are, there's police brutality or things like that. And so the Boston, I think this is the Boston Globe, yeah, they started to create this kind of because all the records are public, but they're just not compiled into a database. So they've started, I think this is back in, it's pretty recent, yeah, back in November. They started to kind of compile this database of all the officers, which you can find. You can sift through all the public records, but there's no database or table where it's quickly accessible. So they've started to do that, where you can kind of actually search and see, how many different types of police officers have different types of records. And these are kind of the internal case affairs for the past 10 years. So that's interesting. They don't, to my knowledge, they're not sharing their tables, which kind of bothers me. I wish that we could actually get their source data for this. But I'll post some of these articles so that you can look at them. The thing I want to do that I think is actionable and interesting to look at is I think it was May 31st, there was a series of riots in Boston. Of course, the term riot is even potentially problematic, but there was vandalism, property damage, all that kind of stuff. But it started off as a peaceful protest in reaction to the George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. And so, it's even hard. It's like murder versus killing versus, all these words carry so much weight and meaning. So I'm going to just straight up front here say I apologize if I'm using language that doesn't jive with your perspective. Even these words, murder, killing, manslaughter, they have very, very legal definitions, and I think it's actually kind of a good point of discussion. But I want you to know that I'm going to do the best I can, and I think my intentions are to try to be thoughtful and inclusive and as objective as I can, but I'll definitely make mistakes, so thanks for your patience. Anyway, I think we can map this. I think we can take the police incident database and look to see what the police activity was on this evening, to just see if it shows up in their database. That would be good to see. So where does the data come from for this? If you just kind of Google search, crime data, Boston, you're going to get a bunch of different things. Luckily, Boston has this kind of open data policy, which is great. So under Analyze Boston, you can go and you can find, let's just open it up here, a whole bunch of different things. Under Public Safety, they've got this Crime Incidents Report 2015 to date, and this is kind of the new system. So what I did is I downloaded 5 years worth of data. I went from 2020 back 5 years to 2016, so all 5 of these years included, and kind of had to mash it together, and I put them into different tables, different CSV files that we're going to look at. In terms of arrests, okay, I found it. It's called Crime Statistics. And this mass.gov crime statistics, you open this up, and it's kind of a little portal where you can go to different things. View detailed arrest information is where I found the data that we're looking for. If you go to Analyze, it'll do some kind of prefabricated stuff. But if you want the source data, go to that other one. And it brings on this online kind of querying system, and you can download tables and, kind of as however you want. So I went to, let's look at Boston, and then for 2020. It has a couple other years, but it doesn't actually provide data, arrest data for Boston in particular for some of these years. It does for other towns, but for some reason Boston, the only comprehensive database I could get for arrests was just for 2020. So that's what we're looking at. So you can view that, and you can and download it. It's also interesting here to check out some of these, under the view, you can kind of see a list of reports. So if you want to see arrest breakdowns by chart, or kind of, this overview here, it can be interesting. I think it's kind of interesting how they try to group these different types of crimes into crimes against persons, crimes against property, crimes against society, and then there's group A offenses and group B offenses. So anyway, if you're interested in looking at some of these summaries, this is where our data comes from. This is for all of Massachusetts, obviously. So I'm sure there's probably some data issues with them trying to compile tons and tons of different departments into one database, but it's the best we have, so that's what we're going to use for arrest statistics. Okay, one more thing before we start to dive into the data, and that's that this week we're kind of starting to do more what's called GeoVisualization, and you might say, okay, that's just a long term. That's how is that any different from cartography? And you can Google it, and even in the some of the readings it talks about it. But the kind of main difference, I think, is that cartography is a concept design in which we try to kind of achieve some type of final product that is putting forth one intent. GeoVisualization, a lot of the time, we don't always know exactly what we're looking for when we start, but we're using the GeoVisualization techniques to kind of look through the data and kind of arrive at some kind of meaning through seeing what the data look like as we visualize them. I know that kind of sounds confusing, but in the same way that until you kind of see the spread of a histogram, sometimes you don't know what your data look like. GeoVisualization is similar. Until we map our spatial data, sometimes we don't know what to look for. So we're kind of doing some GeoVisualization this week, but the end product hopefully will still be a map that we would consider a cartographic kind of effort. So let's look at the data. The rest of this video, what I want to do is I want to look at the data, and in the next video I'll talk about how I'm going to make a work plan for creating a visual, and then in future videos we'll look at using some tools to help us make those visuals. So the next thing to do is open up your tutorial D, and I'm going to look at these in Excel before I open Q. And for this week we've got these. I mean, the main meat of the data is this events database. So we've got the arrests, like I mentioned, but most of it is these crime incidents. And I've got crime incidents chopped up by year here, but then I've also got them all in one giant database. So I'm just going to open this one to show you what it is. Okay, so what we've got are these unique IDs over here, which are incident numbers. We've got an offense code, and we've got kind of an offense description, which relates directly to that code. And a district number, some other things here, whether or not there was a shooting as a binary. I think early it's a 0 or a 1, but then later down in the database, or earlier before even 2019, 2018, it's a null and a 1, or a null and a yes, I think, instead of a 0 and a 1. There's a day of the week. There's sometimes a street, but most importantly, there's a lat and a long. There's kind of a date here. I find date formats to be kind of problematic and difficult to work with in GIS sometimes. So what I've done for you is I've parsed out this date into a date code, which is year, month, day, hour. But then I've also parsed that out into separate columns. So the year column, month, day, hour. And then this join code is going to relate to the arrests data, which we can also open up now. So the arrests data, so the police go out, those are the incidents, but occasionally those incidents result in an arrest. And this is the same incident code here that will join, so it will relate specifically to places in which there are arrests. So not every one of these will relate to every one of those, because sometimes there's, very often, actually most of the time, there's not an arrest made. There's just some kind of response to an incident. But when there is an arrest made, this database tells us, again, what the offense was that they were arrested for, the kind of arrest. So this is the the on view. I mean, mostly they're all on view, and you can read about the differences there. But the age, gender, or sex rather, sorry, the race and ethnicity, and of course, and we'll get into this as we go throughout the weekend. As you should know at this point, that Hispanic is considered an ethnicity, not a race, and so you can have a race and an ethnicity as well. So it's a little confusing, but then you can kind of you can kind of parse between them if you want to include or exclude different races and ethnicities. So we can talk about that as you need. So anyway, we'll join that later. The reason this is parsed this way is that if we were to sort ascending under date code, this is going to go from the earliest date all the way to, or the most recent date to the earliest date in that order, or we could do it the reverse. But we have them parsed into separate categories in case we want to make selections by day or by hour or by month or by year. And so it's effective to have these as separate fields because we can create or statements or and statements and kind of and pick out what we want to see. So the next thing I'd like to do, I think that's good enough. I think we can look at the other data when we're in the GIS program. Before we go to GIS, I think in the next video, which I'm going to, after you finish this video, we'll go to the next one. We're going to look at how should I make a work plan? How can I take this data and look for that May 31st day to see if there are incidents surrounding the riot and the protests? So that's what we'll do next. So I'll see you in the next video.